By reading Matthew. We're continuing our study in the book of Matthew this week. Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 and 22. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." In the first part, which we will not go back and read it all, but in the first part of chapter 15 of Matthew, we see that Jesus had one of his confrontations with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law about cleanliness. The problem was that the Pharisees were, according to the Pharisees, Jesus' disciples hadn't properly washed their hands before they ate. And they were making a big deal out of the fact that they didn't wash their hands right. In response, Jesus talked about how inner cleanliness was more important than the washing of hands. And it was so typical of the Pharisees to be concerned with the outside cleanliness and not really worrying about what was on the inside. That was probably the number one problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees and the religious leaders of his day, is they were all about the exterior and they just let the interior go. So after that confrontation with the Pharisees, Jesus tried to get away from everybody, and they retreated with his disciples to the region of Tyre and Sidon. These were two cities on the Mediterranean Sea. Tyre was about 30 miles from Galilee, and Sidon was further north, and it was about 50 miles from Galilee. So they traveled quite a ways, considering they were on foot. It is clear that because of the location, that Jesus was entering what most Jews would consider pagan territory. This was the land of the Canaanites. And this was significant, especially to who Matthew was writing to. The different men that wrote the different Gospels were writing to different audiences. Matthew was primarily writing to Jews. So this was significant that he was writing that Jesus went into an area that was Gentile, because it was Jewish people that were going to be reading this. Up to that point, Jesus had focused his primary efforts in the land of the Jews, in the area where it was primarily Jewish people. But by traveling to this area, Jesus was making this bold statement that even though salvation comes from the Jews, the message of God's grace is available to everyone, which we should be very thankful for, at least if you're not Jewish. Centuries earlier, Isaiah had made this clear in a prophecy. He said in Isaiah 49:6 that Israel was to be a light to the Gentiles. In other words, it was to come to the Jews first. The plan was to come to the Jews first, and the Jews would then in turn be a light to the Gentiles to lead them to salvation. It didn't really work out quite that way. So here we see Jesus going to the Gentiles himself. Although Jesus being Jewish, it kind of fulfilled that anyway. In spite of Jesus' attempt to avoid people after his confrontation with the Pharisees, we see in the passage we just read that there's this Canaanite woman from the area that finds him and asks him to heal her demon-possessed daughter. Matthew, I believe, used the term Canaanite on purpose. I think it was Mark's gospel, he called her a Syrophoenician woman, which was more specific to an area, but Canaanite covered the whole territory. And I believe this is important that Matthew wrote this. Remember, he was writing to Jews, and the Canaanites were historically one of Israel's fiercest enemies. Remember when the children of Israel came back to the Promised Land, the people that they fought time and time again were the Canaanites, because that was the land of Canaan. So now, we see with all of that put in perspective, here is this descendant of the Canaanites looking to Israel's Messiah for help. And what's particularly interesting about this is that here's this woman of the most hated people of the Jews looking to the Messiah for help when they themselves had already rejected him as the Messiah for the most part. And she calls out to him, "Lord, Son of David." And she called for him to have mercy on her. And it's interesting again that she called him Lord, Son of David, because that said that she recognized who he was. That he was the Messiah. That he was a descendant of David. That he was exactly who he said he was. And still many of his own people that he came to save and that he came to bring salvation to had rejected him. Matthew 15, verses 23 and 24. Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." So we see that Jesus comes into this Gentile territory, and a Gentile woman comes to him asking for help, and he doesn't even respond to her. It says that he answered not a word. And again, we have to keep in mind that Matthew's audience that he was writing to was primarily Jews. And most likely, as Jewish people would read Matthew's account, they would be wondering how a Gentile could possibly fit into their plan of salvation. After all, it was supposed to be their Messiah, not the Gentiles. So Matthew's writing with this kind of slant to it. So what Jesus does in this story is he kind of takes this arm's length approach and attitude toward those people that are rejected by most people that live in Jerusalem. But I think if you look at what Jesus did, he knew that by the way she approached him, that by just being a little standoffish, it wasn't going to make her go away. I think she came with such boldness that even though he didn't answer her, he knew she was going to keep persisting. And so he just kind of kept her at arm's length. And he knew that his initial non-response response wasn't going to deter her from getting what she wanted. But keep in mind, Jesus had healed Gentiles before. This is not the first Gentile person that ever came to Jesus. But this is the first time that Jesus was in a Gentile territory that a Gentile came to him for healing. In fact, this was not just a Gentile territory. This was actually an area that the Jews avoided going to at all. So he was deep into Gentile territory. But we see, if you read the Gospels, you see that Jesus really never followed the traditional guidelines of the rest of the Jewish people, especially when it came to where he went and who he talked to and who he healed and what he offered to them. And apparently, as Jesus thought, his non-response did not quiet the woman down. So the disciples told Jesus, "Why don't you just send her away?" And when you first read this, you might think that because Jesus didn't answer her, that they thought that Jesus wanted her to go away. But here's what I really think was going on here. I think they were saying, "Jesus, why don't you heal her, give her what she wants, so she'll shut up? Just, how hard is it? Just give her what she wants, and then she'll go away." So when you look at it in that way, you see that this woman's persistence, all of a sudden, it seems that she has a couple advocates on her behalf. They're going to Jesus and saying, just give her what she needs. She keeps crying out after she's following us down the road. Just give her what she wants and tell her to go home. And Jesus responds to the lady's plea and the disciples' plea. But he focuses on something more than just the healing. He focuses on the fact that he had a task that he had to complete. And that's where he said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." Even though she had acknowledged him as the son of David, it didn't mean that she automatically had the right to benefit from the original covenant that God had made with the people of Israel. Remember, this whole covenant goes all the way back to Abraham. And it was to the people of Abraham. This lady was not included in that. So even though she recognized who he was, and many Jews did not, this covenant was not with her. But she still persisted. And Jesus was making the point that while the gospel was available to all people, it was to first be presented to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. In another place in the Gospels, we see that there was a Samaritan woman that Jesus met at a well. The name of this well was Jacob's Well. And he talked to her about this divinely established order of presentation. In John 4:22, Jesus told her that salvation is from the Jews. There was this order that was supposed to be in place. And this was not the first time with this woman we're reading about today that Jesus had talked about that. He was trying to make the point, I'm not saying that it's not for you. I'm just saying that it's for the Jews first, and then for the Gentiles. Matthew chapter 15, verses 25 through 28. The woman came and knelt before him. Lord, help me, she said. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. Yes, Lord, she said, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Then Jesus answered, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. If you look at Jesus' upbringing, you see that Jesus himself had a very persistent mother. There was a wedding at Cana that Jesus happened to be at along with Mary. And Mary recognized that there was going to be this hospitality problem. They were running out of wine. And she knew that Jesus could take care of it. And she went to Jesus and said, why don't you just handle this? And no. But she persisted. She even told the servants, help him out. Go get these pots and fill them with water and bring them back because he's going to do something here. She was persistent. So maybe the past experiences of Jesus growing up and seeing how persistent a mother could be kind of let him know that this woman, it wasn't for herself. She was going to persist on the behalf of her daughter if she had to follow him all around the country. Kind of like the disciples said, give her what she wants, she'll go away. And he also knew that she wasn't going to stop simply because he gave this mission statement of, well, it's to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. She was like, okay, that's good. Now, what are you going to do for my daughter? I appreciate the fact that it's for the Jews first and then the Gentiles, but it says that she fell down on her knees and pleaded with him. And I don't think that she would have given up no matter what, because we see that the mental and the spiritual health of her child was at stake. And by falling to her knees, she adds passion to her plea. At first, it's just following him down the road saying, Lord, Son of David, and calling out that she needed help. But now she's literally on her knees before him and adding this passionate plea, Lord, help me. And then Jesus tells his story, this euphemism. And in this euphemism, the children are the people of Israel, and the dogs are the Gentiles. I was reading somewhere that not necessarily in Matthew's gospel, but in Mark's gospel, the word that Mark used for dogs here was actually a term more translated towards puppies, like a household pet, not a stray dog that's just wandering around the neighborhood, but it was a household pet that could be part of the family, even though it was still a dog. So even though it was an insult, it was kind of a minor insult. Be called a dog was clearly an insult. And and here's another way to look at this. Jesus is using this analogy of children being fed at the table. And so he took this diminutive term and he puts it in the context of a family meal. Here are the children being fed at a table. I'm not going to take their food and give it to the dogs. He wasn't saying he wasn't going to feed the dogs. He said he's going to feed the children first. And by saying that, he was, again, reiterating the fact that the gospel was going to be presented to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. So finally the woman concedes to Jesus' point. She says, okay, I get it. "Yes, Lord." But she still asked him to make an exception on the behalf of her child. "I understand what you're saying. I realize that I'm a dog. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And it's kind of interesting to see that by extending Jesus' metaphor, it not only shows that she was very quick thinking, but that she had a great deal of wisdom. Here he started telling this story about taking food from the children and giving to the dogs, and she just carries it right on out and says, "Yeah, I know, but even the dogs get the crumbs." She was saying, "I'm not trying to lay hold to what's on the table of the children. I just want anything that falls off. I'm not trying to take away from what you came to give to the Jews, but could you give me just a little portion to help my daughter?" She still wasn't giving up. In other words, she was asking for grace. She was saying, "I know I don't deserve it, but would you do it anyway?" And that's what we have today. We have grace. We don't deserve salvation. There's nothing that we could ever do to deserve salvation. You could live your life and do all good things, but we could not pay back the cost of salvation. It's only through grace. And I believe this lady knew that this Son of God could not only accomplish his mission that he was sent to do, but he could also make a small provision for her. Because she knew that all she needed was just a tiny crumb of God's grace, and this present crisis would be over. And once again, Jesus expresses amazement and surprise over the depth of this Gentile woman's faith. And you see that he stops talking about the whole covenant thing, because he's just amazed at this woman's persistence. He's made his point. And now the overwhelming passion of Jesus that we expect to see comes flooding out, and he grants her request. And the scripture says that her daughter was healed in that very hour. Her daughter wasn't there. And if you look back through the New Testament, it's interesting to see that in the case of three different healings in the New Testament, there was one here that we just read, the demonic daughter of this Canaanite woman. There was the sick son of a nobleman, and there was this lunatic child of another man. In each of these cases, the child could not advocate for him or herself. Somebody else was doing it on their behalf. In each of those cases, the parent persisted in order to end their child's suffering. This lady's child wasn't there. And it wasn't even her personal problem. She wasn't sick. She wasn't possessed, as the man we talked about last week was. But it was her daughter, and she persisted, and she followed, and she wouldn't leave Jesus alone. And she begged and pleaded and said, "Jesus, you have to heal my daughter." And sometimes it is our faith on behalf of someone else that brings about the answer to a desperate situation. Sometimes the person that's in need is just not capable of having the faith to receive what they need. Maybe that person is just not able to persist, maybe because of an illness of some type, and that we have to stand for them and persist to God. And I believe that it's important to note that whether it's our personal need or whether we're persisting on behalf of someone else, I believe we need to do it with the same fervency. Because if we're not careful, what happens when it's us, we don't have any problem falling before the Lord and pleading and falling on our knees. And when it's someone else, Lord, you just need to help them out. And we just end it right there. But we see an example from this woman here that it wasn't for her. It was for her child. It was for somebody else. But she had the same persistence as if it would have been her herself. And I believe it's important for us to make note of this story for that very reason. That when we are persisting to God on behalf of someone else, that we do it with the same intensity that we would do it if it was us. Yesterday was an interesting day. I was trying to finish my notes and finish my lesson, and I actually wrote the end before I wrote the lesson itself, which is kind of different too. And towards the end of the day, I saw the mail truck come around, and I thought, well, the mailman already ran. But this was a friend of mine that I've gotten to know that used to be my mailman. And he came by specifically just to stop and talk. And he's just an incredible Christian guy. And we're talking about things because I hadn't seen him in about a month or so. And he asked me how I was doing, and we talked about different things. He said, my family's been going through some serious stuff. He said, you pray? Yeah. He said, do you pray in the Holy Ghost? Yeah. He said, let me tell you something. We've had some serious family problems, and he told me about some things that just absolutely were just amazing that were going on. Not amazing good, amazing bad. And he said, but I found myself, he said, sometimes I'll go to bed at 8:30, 9 o'clock because I get up about 5 o'clock in the morning. He said, but I found myself being woken up in the middle of the night, sometimes at midnight. And so I just go into the TV room and don't turn anything on, and I just start praying. He said, about a week ago, he said, I went in there and started praying, and I happened to glance at the clock, and it was just after midnight. And I started praying, and he said, all of a sudden I was in the Spirit, and I was praying in the Holy Ghost, and a few minutes passed, and when I stopped, I looked at the clock, and it was 20 after 1. He said, I was just completely caught up in the Spirit. He said, but there was so many needs that once I started praying, it just flowed. And he said, I just couldn't stop. He said, and I know that the answers that we're seeing for these tremendous needs in our family are because of that type of prayer. And I'm thinking, God, that wasn't an accident that you sent him by. Because he looked at me and he said, that's what you need to do. You just have to be persistent and just pray. And if you wake up in the middle of the night, just pray. He said, that's what I've been doing. He said, and when I'm done, I just get up and I go back to bed and go to sleep. And I'm thinking, that's exactly what this woman was this whole story of this woman was telling us, that we just persist and we seek after God. But here's a question that comes to the mind of many Christians. But what if we don't see an answer? There's that whole thing about why do bad things happen to good people? Why do we see people that are Christians like this friend of mine that's the mailman? Why do we see bad things happen to a man that is a good, godly man? And I will tell you, I don't have the answer to that. And I've done a lot of reading about it, and I don't really think anybody has the answer to that. In 1960, many Americans and Europeans left what was then known as the Belgian Congo. And they were leaving because this was just as civil war was breaking out that would eventually lead to the country's independence from Belgium. That country is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's where I spent a couple of weeks this past year. During that time in 1960, there was one person in particular that stayed behind to continue her work. Her name was Dr. Helen Roseveare. One day, the mission station where she was was overrun by Congolese troops, rebel Congolese troops. And over a period of several months after that, Dr. Reservoir was severely beaten and gang raped. And in the weeks and the months that followed that, she said that several times she asked God, "Why, Lord, why?" She wrote later that as she started to come to terms with those horrific events, and how she came to terms with those horrific events was when she felt that God was asking her, and this is important, "Helen, can you thank me for trusting you with this experience, even if I never tell you why?" And I thought about this yesterday because probably about 15 years ago, I heard that story on the radio, and I wrote it down on a little piece of paper and put it in my wallet. And as I was thinking about this yesterday, I actually looked it up so I could get everything just right as far as the story. And there's been many times that I have pulled that piece of paper out of my wallet. And I've asked myself, could I do that? Can I trust God? Can I thank God for trusting me with this experience, even if He never tells me why? I have a friend, his name is Adam Hood. He started off as a customer and now he's a friend. He's a young man. He was injured in a motorcycle accident, and as a result of that became paralyzed from his waist down. A young man in his 20s. But because of the accident, he found himself doing some things that he had never done before. He was kind of a troubled young man. And after all this happened, it changed who he was. In fact, one of the things that he started doing that amazed me is he started water skiing, even though he's paralyzed from the waist down. He even started competing on a national level. If you ever come to my office, there's pictures. I have a frame with several pictures of him water skiing at a competition. It's an amazing story. But another thing he started doing was playing basketball. And as he came in and his mom and dad came in, they started talking about the changes in his life. And one of the things that just I thought was just so amazing is that his dad went out and bought a wheelchair so that he and Adam could play basketball one-on-one. And by doing this, it allowed his dad to get down to the same level as Adam and see things exactly the same way that Adam saw them. And here's the point. God Himself knows how we feel. When we think that Jesus was God with flesh on, this means that He came down to our level. And through that, God experienced what it's like to be tired, what it's like to be discouraged. He knows what it's like to hurt. He knows what it's like to bleed. On the cross, Jesus Himself prayed a psalm of lament. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus knew what it was like to feel abandoned. He knew what it was like to feel alone. And in your pain, you might be tempted to say, "God, you have no idea what I'm going through. You have no idea how bad I'm hurting." But because of all of those things, God can respond, "Yes, I do." He can point at your wounds and then point to His own and say, "See, I have them too. I entered a world, your world, and I know how you feel. I've been there. I'm with you now. I care, and I can help. When we're faced with things that we don't understand, or in those times that we feel life is unfair, we can find ourselves just like this lady in the Congo asking, why, Lord? Why? And at that point, we have a choice. We can walk away from God, or we can choose to believe that there is a bigger picture that we can't see. And we have to choose to go on. We have to choose to persist. Holding on to the things that do make sense, and holding on even when things don't make sense. I believe we have to choose to believe that the Bible is true. We have to believe that God does love us in spite of circumstances. And I believe what helps us get through that is that we believe that He does know what pain is, and He does feel our pain. Maybe we can't see the purposes for the circumstances that we're in right now. And maybe we will never even see what God is doing this side of heaven. But I will assure you of this, that whatever is going on in your life right now, good or bad, is part of a story that God is writing. Sometimes we just have to trust God in the way that Job did. In Job 13 and 15, he said, though He slay me, yet will I hope in Him. If you're struggling right now with a situation that seems impossible, don't give up. Even if the answer does not come right away, continue with persistence. Look at this woman that we read about today. She knew that she didn't deserve it. She just didn't care. Lord, I know I don't deserve it. I know that You came for your own people, but could You just make an exception for me? And not even for me, it's for my daughter. I think sometimes our unhealthy response to suffering often stems from a biblically baseless set of expectations. Expectations of what we think and how we think a loving God should act under certain circumstances. The problem is they're our version of it. And it's because in our mind, too often God's response is not what we would have liked for it to be. And a lot of times it's not within the timing that we thought it should be in. I think what will help in that is that we need to be open to sometimes unexplainable mysteries of the working of God's sovereign will. Sometimes we just have to say, Lord, I don't understand. I don't know why. As Job said, Job 1 and 21, he said, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. But He didn't stop there. May the name of the Lord be praised, whether He gives or whether He takes away. It's only human to wonder why when we don't have an answer for something. It's just human nature. If you've ever raised children, you know that sometimes you tell them something and they go, why? Because they don't know. And we kind of grow up to be adults that do the same thing when we don't understand what God is doing in our lives. And things happen and we say, why? We might say, God, I don't understand. But it needs to be followed with, but I will still trust You. God, I don't understand. But I'll still thank You even if I have to wait till I get to heaven to find out what it's all about. And we have to believe and know that even if he never tells us why while we're on this earth, be assured that he's still the one in control. And that he trusts you with this experience. And that if we trust him, he will carry us through whatever test we face, and ultimately, he will reward our faith. God bless you.